and to do this. So I'm very, very happy to be here tonight. Tonight in Australia, I don't know where, like we might have someone in the morning somewhere in the world. So big pleasure to be here. I'll just a short introduction about myself. I have a background. I have an interdisciplinary background. So I'm an architect originally, but I started working as a trend forecaster in 2014 for different companies and for different industries, not just fashion, but I worked for companies, for example, like Google, Netflix, YouTube, Ford, Panasonic, and so on. So my field is a field of consumer goods and consequently consumption. Like in the last few years, I just started to feel that I had to propose something else for practitioners working in this space, right? And it's basically because of sustainability and basically because we need to guarantee our future or our futures in the plural form. So I did a master's design, a master research in design, where I studied color forecasting, also in the fashion industry to understand the methods and how it was, what was happening and how accurate it was and things like that. I published a book on color forecasting, but I started after my master's degree to feel like a little bit uneasy with my practice. And then for this reason, I came to Australia to do my PhD. I started in 2019 and finished last year in the end of the year. So I'm very happy to share with everyone here what I developed over these years. But more than that, I'm planning to kind of talk, not much, but maybe to talk for 20, 25 minutes. And if we have some time at the end, we might kind of experiment a little bit with part of the tools. It's not all of them because we will not have time. But if we can, we might dedicate like 10 minutes to kind of explore a little bit the cards and how the method works, if everyone feels okay with that. Right, so I'll just share my screen. I don't know if you can see my keynote. I think you can. I'm not sure. I just have to test if when I play it, it shows like the transition of slides or if it just stays in the first slide. Is it changing for you guys?
Now it's black.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's black because, yeah, I think it is video. All right, lovely. So here we are. Awesome. So then, basically what I did, so just coming back, fashion futurism is methodology for enacting transitions towards sustainability. And what was important for that, as I said, was my interest in investigating a little bit of like possibilities around trend forecasting in the context of fashion that could lead us to more sustainable futures and more like different ways of thinking about futures, in particular in this industry, because I see fashion as like the worst case scenario when we think about trends and consumption in the consumer goods sector, generally speaking. So my supervisors, just to acknowledge them, John Sweeney, thanks, John. John is not here, but many thanks to John. I think everyone knows him. Jenny Underwood and Yoko Kama. And like fashion featuring is basically like this methodology that is like created to enact a values-driven transition and to position values at the center of everything, right? So instead of positioning profit at the center of any kind of prediction or any kind of forecasting possibility, what fashion futuring wants to do and was developed for was to kind of put the values at the center of this future thinking possibility, right? So it is basically as I said, it was like inspired by my own practice as a trend forecaster So over the years, I've been working, as I said, to many different industries and brands like Google, Netflix, I don't know, Ford, so many, Panasonic, and so on. And I was like developing those like trend reports and thinking that our role as trend forecasters is to interpret social cultural changes to minimize uncertainty, right? So we were kind of, as trend forecasters, our role in this field is to capture and interpret those changes to minimize uncertainty. But then looking at like all these reports, I started to think, but shouldn't we be kind of exploring more futures rather than narrowing them down? And why are we doing that? So what is our role when we think about futures in this way? So I started to think that trend forecasting is actually a practice that connects culture, industry, and consumption, right? So it is kind of intertwining those three forces, and one thing is informing another. So the industry is not only capturing from culture what is happening in terms of trends and new behaviors and emerging signals of change, but it's also at the point that trend forecasters capture what culture is doing and provoking as a change, it's also kind of packing it and bouncing it back into culture and informing and shaping culture according to those like visions or to those like possibilities designed by trend forecasters. And it is made to feed into kind of improve, let's put like that, consumption, right? The problem with that is that fashion forecasting, as it is now, it is a practice that is kind of leaving behind the idea of planetary boundaries. We are, of course, at trend forecasters, that we talk a lot about sustainability. We try to put sustainability in reports. We try to make the fashion industry to operate in new formats and according to new values and principles. And we really try to do that, but I think that we are failing. And we are failing for some reasons. This is, for example, one a screenshot of H&M, the website. And what I found looking at this promise, because it's a promise, right, that the fashion industry is trying to give us, is that we can change fashion by closing the loop, by minimizing waste, by promoting or provoking developments in new materials that are kind of, for example, organic or recyclable, et cetera, et cetera. That's so good, and this effort is very welcome and it's very necessary. However, when we look at this approach, what we see is that fashion, when we talk about sustainability in these terms, recycling, green products, minimizing waste, I don't know, less pollution, et cetera, what we are talking is about the fashion in terms of clothing, is about the fashion in its materiality. Then sustainability in the fashion industry is mostly framed from a material aspect, but fashion is not just clothing, fashion is culture. And when we think about fashion as culture, this is where trend forecasters, designers, manufacturers, anyone in the fashion industry is not trying to change anything. And that's the reason why I started to think, how can we kind of provoke possibilities for us to insert culture in this equation of sustainability in fashion? So how can we look differently to sustainability in the fashion industry that is not only from its material aspect, but that brings culture inside this equation? And sometimes maybe bringing culture as like the most important point of this equation might be even more important than just, I'll put just between quotes, but just like proposing improvements in terms of materiality and manufacturing processes and materials and etc. So I'm not saying that it's, again, that it's not, that it's like useless or that it's just like, that is a movement that is not valuable in the fashion industry. I'm just saying that it is not enough. If we want to change the paradigm of fashion towards sustainability for real, we really need to address culture as a problem. We really need to look at culture and consumerism with like very much attention. And one of the things that trend forecasting in fashion does is like decreasing the potential futures and trying to create narratives that kind of narrow those potentialities down to get into more predicted futures, right? So instead of having multiple possibilities, what we do is like we try to transform uncertainty into certainty. We try to bring to the industry some certainty about the future. And again, it could be nice. We're not giving the industry just one possibility. We give some. However, there are so many others that we are not bringing to light because it is not profitable. If we think about the industry and how trend forecasting operates, trend forecasting goes into this thinking that the past is one, and then from that past, we go to a present that is one present. And then from this present, we go to a future, again, in the singular. The past in fashion is like, is it just one past? That's my first question. Are we just living in one present? That's my second question. And how many futures can we envision, right? That is not just one future. The future of fashion right now is based on the idea that, okay, let's turn all the materials recyclable and let's minimize waste. And then we get all sorted out, which is not true. At the same time, when we think about the present and the past as a singular form, I think that we are kind of looking at them just because when we look at trend forecasting in the fashion industry, what it does is that it goes into a linear way, starting 2 years before the seasons to inform color forecasting and then inform fibers and yarns and textiles and trade fairs and design and manufacturing to then get into culture again in a format of campaigns and products that will definitely inform style and brand identification. Those things here, they happen in a linear way again, and they are orchestrated. So the role of trend forecasting today is very much to kind of keep the industry operating at a large scale and in its full efficiency to produce more and to do it in a less, like effortlessly, I guess. The problem with that system is that I think that we should start to consider that we don't have one past, one present, and one future, but we have many pasts, many presents, and many futures. One day I was watching a presentation about the future of fashion of a fashion magazine, and they were saying that the future of fashion would be digital. And I was thinking, this is a future that could be a future for those living in Europe, living in the US, living in Canada, or what I mean in rich countries. But when we look at the global south, the future of fashion looks like more around a great landfill rather than a digital fashion future, right? So I think that we have to understand that it's not just about the multiplicity of futures, but also the multiplicity of presents and the different possibilities that we have when we frame our visions and our values around futures. So when I started thinking about all of this, I saw that like the gap in this knowledge was that like the reason for fashion futuring would be that transitioning to this more radical sustainability means embracing culture and uncertainty as fuel for transformation. So instead of looking just at the material aspect of fashion and trying to predict futures, we should embrace uncertainty and embrace culture as this potential fuel for transformation. So then my research question at my PhD was this one, like how could trend forecasting practice in fashion shift or expand to enact a value-driven transition towards sustainable futures, right? So how can we propose? I'm not proposing that trend forecasting should end. I am proposing that we have to find alternatives, not as future alternatives, but alternatives for looking and framing futures thinking in the industry. Fashion futuring is not one, like it's just one possibility amongst many. We can propose many other possibilities, but I think that we as trend forecasters, we as designers, we as futurists, I think that we need to propose alternatives for futures thinking as well. How do we frame futures thinking in a different way? So then my PhD, I did it in 4 stages that I called deep diving, reorienting, floating, and landing. So deep diving, I did an analysis of my practice, a literature review. I interviewed some experts in the field. Then I started to expand into a different community of practice, looking at people working with design and future studies. Then I started to run some workshops with different audiences, and then I landed my new practice in another territory that was not the territory of trend forecasting. So in deep diving, what I did was the first thing was to look at the history of trend forecasting. And I started to think how society and culture, trend diffusion models, industry models, the practice itself, how they are intertwined and how they influence one another. So in the beginning of trend forecasting in fashion, we had some dolls. The dolls was the first kind of artifact to spread trends, right? But then we started to see fashion editors, catwalks, fashion magazines, but they were once a month, once every 2 months. And then in the end, now what we have is like a TikTok trend with multiple styles in 15 seconds. Also, we have fast fashion models, super ultra fast fashion models as well, running and at high speed and really producing much more than we were producing in the past and expecting to produce and consume in the past as well. Those were the experts that I interviewed. So many thanks for all of them for their time. And by interviewing them, I found that like trend forecasting is manufacturing speed of change. I found that it's based on prediction rather than possibilities. I found that it's very much an elitist practice, like mainly led by white people in rich countries. And I also understood that it's in its core unsustainable because it's made to inspire people and to drive consumerism. So in short, fashion forecasting creates narratives on an exclusionary model to produce short-term predictions in the name of large-scale production and profit, despite the sustainability crisis. So in the end of the day, although fashion forecasting and trend forecasting in fashion is trying to bring some reports around sustainability and the importance of this and that, the dominant cultural narrative, the new and the better, still prevails. And that's what is behind trend forecasting as a practice. Trend forecasting, when we give to the industry new directions, new possibilities, every month, we are actually giving them new fuel to produce novelty and to instigate consumerism at scale. So in reorienting my practice, when I started to look at like, what else could I be inspired by, who was actually working in something that could be an inspiration for me to look beyond my own practice, I started to move beyond trend forecasting as a field, and I started to look at future studies as a whole, also speculative design, co-design and transition design, sustainability as culture, fashion as material culture. And then I started to relocate my practice in that field instead of in trend forecasting. Also, when I started this project, based on like my first findings, I set up like some beacons to remind me what I couldn't miss, because this was a practice-based doctoral research. So I was actually producing knowledge through my practice, not through theory. So I was like, okay, if I'm proposing a new method or a new tool or a new something, I have to have some principles in mind to not be lost in the way and repeat myself in what I already do, right? So the three beacons for me were like sustainability that comes from this idea of sustainability as culture. A collaborative imagination was important as well. So instead of operating in an elitist mindset, I should bring people together to collaborate and to expand ideas. And also I should explore alternatives rather than try to predict stories and narratives. In the last stage, I started to test like new tools and new possibilities, right? So my first thinking about if I wanted to frame sustainability from a cultural perspective, then I should maybe start to think about the role of fashion in culture. And when we look back on time, we see that fashion has multiple meanings that were changing over time. So fashion back then was like seen as a social distinction, for example. Today, it's more around communication and self-expression. When you ask people like, what is fashion about? Many of them will answer, it is about self-expression. However, the idea of self, the self, is also rooted in the modernity, where the self is this like individual. It is like, it's just about myself, my interests, my style, my life. And I think that now we have to try to expand the idea of fashion from the self-expression to maybe a collective tool, a collective something. I think that the planet as it is and the sustainability crisis is kind of, they are calling us to think about fashion beyond the self. And I think that we should embrace some collective lenses to think about it. So then I started to think, what new cultural meanings then fashion might assume in futures that could lead us to transition to sustainable systems, right? If fashion was about social distinction and it is now about self-expression, then what new meanings it might have in the future? So in doing that, I created the toolkit and I tested like many different tools, many different formats. I tested it in more than 10 workshops. I involved more than 100 people in those workshops. So thanks a lot for all the people that participated. It was really important to have everyone. And I created those 7 tools here. Those 7 tools, they are not static. They are not mandatory. So they are just one form of playing with fashion futuring, and any facilitator can modify those tools, can move them around. I tested like moving them in different ways, in a different order. I tried like subtracting some of them, adding some orders. So I think that it's just like a preliminary possibility and one possibility that we could have. So those tools, they are also supported by some boards. So we have a set of cards, but also we have some boards that help people to get along. And the cards, they are formed by this set that has like different types, different categories of cards. But before getting there, this is a prototype of one of my first trials. And in the beginning, I had, for example, a persona card and I have a context card. So the persona was kind of describing a person in the future, and the context were kind of describing a context, for example, exclusion, flourishing, hope. So it was kind of based on the future's archetypes, but kind of there was a text kind of saying a little bit about what this future looked like, right? But then after running some sessions with participants, I started to see that they were kind of frustrated with the idea that the contexts were kind of very much typical, very much kind of predictive. So they were not helping them to expand ideas. They were actually framing and kind of decreasing and trapping imagination. So I started to think, okay, so then how can I think about a different way to prompt this imagination towards futures that it's not, that is not that much controlling. I just started to think that some sets and some cards in futures thinking, they are very helpful, definitely, but they might also be tricky because they might trap participants' imagination somehow. And so I started to think, okay, so what can I do in this way? And then I started to think that to spark imagination, I should actually explore imagery instead of scenarios and contexts like written scenarios and like defined scenarios. So people were kind of exploring futures in like by looking at images such as those ones here. So we had like context imagery, like that is this one on the bottom. And we have like what I called provocation images that are like images related to sustainability. And they are kind of, instead of like asking them like what the future of fashion looks like, I was actually asking them to think about if this is an image about future, if this is a snapshot, if this is a photograph of the future, what future is this? What is happening in this social context, right? And so based on that, for example, in this, this is one of the images of the deck. And in this one, people said, have to find it here because I don't remember exactly what they said, but participants said, just a second, guys, I'm sorry, we're talking and forgot to, yeah, they said, one of them said, for me, it looks like a mix between the primitive life and the virtual, a place in harmony, a peaceful and magical landscape, but also it is something where everybody is very individualistic. Everyone is living on their own, doing their own individual wonder. So this is, for example, instead of asking what the future of fashion looks like, I was asking beforehand, what is this future in your fantasy, in your fictional space, instead of trying to get them to give me answers. Because when I started this project as well, one of the exercises was kind of a timeline, past, present, and futures. And then at some point, someone said, I don't know how fashion was in the 80s. And then I was like, but this is not an exercise to give right answers. It is an exercise of imagination. So then I started to think how we could really expand into a different approach to help people to think less rationally and more creatively, I guess. And so we have here like some examples of imagery that I used in the set. Some of them were replaced, some of them were just disappeared. I lost like the reference. But in any case, it is like a combination of cards in many, as in many sets that we already have. For example, the Think for the Future by Stuart Candy, some initiatives of Global Swarm. So there are lots of methods that inspired me to get into this result, of course. But also, I think that one of the stories here is that I also started to think there is this stage where people start to design fictional artifacts based on the fictional stories, right? So instead of designing the artifact from the beginning, they firstly design the social cultural context, and then they design a fashion artifact to be placed in that future, in that social cultural context. And why is that? Because fashion is very much shaped by the way we see the world, by our worldviews, and by the social cultural context. So then at this stage, they were kind of designing the artifacts, but they had already like a fictional scenario, a fictional story going on, and they were invited to think that they were designers in this future. And so they had to kind of create an artifact. And the result, for example, one of the results here was that this was the cards of the provocation cards for this group. And they said that in this future, people started, we started to see new populations that were called hybrids. And these hybrids were mutant beings, a mix of humans and animals that were trying to survive in an earth that became just this big landfill, right? And so they designed these artifacts that was kind of DNA editor that was kind of made to sense the environment and to give human beings like characteristics and abilities from other animals, such as nocturnal vision or fat storage. But what was important for me here was not the fashion artifact in itself. It is not the product, but it is what it means in culture. And so the next question that comes afterwards, after like having the artifact, having the story and having the artifact designed, is that if these artifacts becomes popular in this future, as for example, today the sneakers are, or the iPhones are, if this object becomes popular in this future, then what does it mean for fashion? What fashion is saying about it as a role in society? And so, for example, in this exercise, this group got to this idea that fashion was not about self-expression anymore, but it was about reconfiguration, adaptation, and survival mode. So here we see that fashion, like that the method helps participants to think about new values for fashion, new possibilities for fashion that are not about machinery, are not about materials, are not about processes, but are about culture and societal values, right? And I also started to compare the results before the speculative stage and afterwards. And before, like when you ask people what fashion looks like in the future, like what people generally answer is what is in the horizon already. It's about trends, right? So they give you answers that are like, that we are already expecting. And I was kind of frustrated because I was like, well, but we know that, but we are not going in a good way that way. We need to think further. We need to think beyond that. And that's why I started to think about the speculative design as a tool to help people to really embrace the unknown, to really go into the imagination and to really think beyond trends, beyond what is already in the horizon. And so, for example, after the speculative stage, fashion is seen as reconfiguration. Here are also some other results. So like before and after the speculative stage, so fashion seen as protection, shield, heritage, regeneration, care, and affection. However, here, like an example of a scenario and like some exercise of one of the groups. But I think that more than that, one of the problems or the critics that speculative design suffers is that sometimes it's just confined to museums and to experts. So it is a tool or a method or an approach, as you like, that kind of becomes still in a bubble of the elite per se. And so I was thinking, okay, also after running some workshops, participants were kind of frustrated because they were like, oh, it was fun. It was very lovely to imagine. We really had fun. That's very nice, creative exercise, etc. But what is this for? And then I started to think, how can I bridge the gap between imagination and action, imagination and planning, imagination and concreteness? How can we really combine and use the force of creativity to really inspire action? And then I created this last step that is like what I called the fashion futuring wheel. And it is this systemic kind of approach where participants go into a backcasting method, but it is, instead of placing at the center the product or the artifact, what we place at the center is the value. So what are the values? If fashion is about configuration, if fashion is about care, if fashion is about protection, then what are the implications of those values in those sectors of the industry, right? So how can those values inform a new form of thinking around, for example, manufacturing, around politics, education, consumption, design principles? And this is important because there is also something around trend forecasting in the fashion, specifically speaking, field that is about the product, the narratives and the product. So, but what about the other pieces of the systems? How can education, for example, play a fundamental role in changing the way we see and imagine fashion in the future, right? So, for example, in this example here, they had fashioners taking care. And in education, for example, they arrived at the conclusion that in education, the schools should integrate in their curriculums biology to help fashion designers to think through multi-species lenses instead of just thinking about the product and the material and the polyester and et cetera, et cetera. And so we have like this idea, we have the artifacts, but also the meanings that comes into fashion, and also like the implications of what kind of change or action we could expect if the values about fashion would change, right? So fashion futuring is actually at the intersection between strategic foresight, material culture, and speculative design. And it is also like in terms of comparison with trend forecasting, when we see trend forecasting, it is in the market research and social science, but fashion futuring is in the speculative design, transition design spaces. We also, when we compare trend forecasting with fashion futuring, we see, for example, that in trend forecasting, forecasters are gatekeepers, while in fashion futuring, they are facilitators. Trend forecasting is elitist, fashion futuring is collaborative. One is short-term, the other one is long-term. One is focused on silos, the other one in systems. One is based on facts, and the other one is based on fiction. One is for profit, the other one is for transition. So here we have the tools, but also after like having all the tools and reflecting on fashion futuring, I started to see that behind it, I had actually this framework that can be adaptable to other sectors and to other possibilities. So it is basically a first stage that is exploring the knowns and the assumptions. The second one, it goes into fiction and emotion, intuition. It is like beyond possible worlds, it's beyond probability. Then it goes into values, interpretation of those values, and then it goes into the transition that it is about creating a strategy for concrete action. So fashion futuring actually can be, as I said, adapted to all the scenarios and to all the industries. So I'm now working on the adaptation of it for cities in architecture. As I am an architect, I think that there is a potential. So I ran a couple of sessions with architects and urban planners, and then I'm now prototyping the cards for cities in architecture. If you want, just get in touch to have the cards, because as they have imagery and the authors didn't respond me, so I don't have the rights to use them. But you can get in touch with me, and I'm now developing with QR codes, so people can just scan the QR code and see the image to play with the cards. But you can go into fashion featuring, and there is more information there in the website, and also the boards for download. I published 3 papers about this project, and also I won 5 awards with this project as well. I think that's it. Thank you so much.